exploitation, political meddling, and military aggression. I'm not talking about the dictator of a banana republic. I'm talking about a private company whose personal army was 3 times that of the British Army. The East India Company sounds like a sort of capitalistic nightmare ripped straight out of the pages of a Philipp K Dick novel. But these guys were a real dystopian force. Their time may be over, but the consequences of their actions shape this world as we know it. Chapter 1. Greed, Gold, and Goods. In 1557, a few years before the unofficial Anglo-Spanish War, Francis Drake decided to explore the bank accounts of Spanish settlements in South America. Once he plundered the Spanish colonies, he darted back across the Pacific Ocean until touching down in the East Indies. While traveling through the Molucca Islands, he met Sultan Babullah, then ruler of the Sultanate of Ternate, one of the oldest Muslim kingdoms in Indonesia. This guy was the greatest of the sultans, having run out the Portuguese occupants. Under his rule, the Sultanate reached its golden peak thanks to his reign of free trade and access to valuable forest resources. For Francis Drake, the maritime door-to-door salesman, this was the perfect client. After all, both him and the Sultan shared a common enemy with the Portuguese, who were in cahoots with the Spanish. Drake offered his linens, gold, and silver. But let's call it what it really was. Evil thing number 1. Selling stolen goods. In return, the Sultan offered Drake hugely valuable exotic spices, like cloves and nutmeg, but Drake didn't know how pricey these things were until he returned to England in 1580. Investors in Drake's original expedition saw ginormous returns on his haul. Drake had become a celebrated hero overnight. Everyone wanted to capitalize on trade with the far-off East Indies, but they couldn't do that without more naval power. They got that in 1588, when Queen Elizabeth I's kingdom seized Spanish and Portuguese ships and cargo upon defeating the Spanish Armada. These vessels made exploring the world for riches a cinch. But to finish the Spanish and Portuguese off for good, they needed to push their rivals out of the East Indies trade routes. That came easy though. A few more naval battles later, and England had established firm connections. Though, with the emergence of this new market, the stage was set for one company to step out of the shadows to become a monopoly. So it's time to learn how history works as we tally up the evil crimes of the East India Company. We now turn your attention away from our scheduled programming to bring you a message from our sponsor, Compounded Daily. Friends, each week there's a bundle of riveting tales that regrettably can't make their debut here, all due to the whims of the YouTube algorithm. But fret not. By enlisting in my brand new and absolutely free email newsletter, you'll be in the know with stories like the intriguing inception of a VC fund by our allies at NATO. This newsletter, dear viewers, will traverse the exciting worlds of finance, business, and economics, ensuring you're always in the loop. If the topics discussed here pique your interest, then rest assured, you'll find the newsletter a delightful read. It's not only enjoyable, but also enlightening, offering you fresh insights from yours truly, a seasoned veteran in the investment banking world. Becoming a part of our newsletter family is as simple as 1, 2, 3, folks. Simply use the link provided in the description, make your way to compoundeddaily.com, and then sign up with the email you use the most. Chapter 2. The Sinister Start. In 1599, merchant all-stars banded together to create a supergroup. There was adventurer merchant Ralph Fitch, whose 9-year tour of Persia and Mesopotamia was legendary. Next was James Lancaster, who found a new route to India. Stephen Sawami was the mayor of London and a merchant in his own right. Then there was Thomas Smith, another powerful politician. The final member was Richard Hakluyt. He had sailed with Drake, founded successful trade companies before, and was a bigger supporter of colonialism. With their powers combined, they applied for a royal charter. This official decree from the monarch would make them a monopoly. Their argument was that they had the expertise to mitigate risks from piracy and treacherous seas. Consolidating power made it more efficient and easier to compete with other European nations. And their expeditions could serve broad political agendas set by the crown. Some say this shows a lack of spirit for the free market. Personally, I call it evil thing number 2, cheating. The Queen rejected their application. Spain and Portugal were still powerful, so she didn't want to risk a diplomatic crisis or another war. So they did what all budding entrepreneurs do and tried again and again. In time, circumstances changed. Britain's navy became more powerful, and the Protestant Reformation freed Britain from its Catholic ties with Spain and Portugal. Now, the Queen saw the virtues of a state-sponsored business enterprise. On the 31st of December 1600, the charter was granted and the East India Company was greenlit as the world's first corporate raiders. Interestingly, James Lancaster, who captained the first voyage, was born and raised in Portugal, though he got the job because his previous experience in the East Indies provided intel about Portuguese presence in the area. During the trip, the company seized a Portuguese carrack loaded with spices and pepper. This precious booty helped them set up trading posts on the subcontinent to break up Spain and Portugal's duopoly. By the time they returned to England, the Queen had died. However, the newly crowned James I was so impressed with their maiden voyage that he knighted Captain James Lancaster. Oh sorry, Sir Captain James Lancaster. But despite these accomplishments and accolades, the company was struggling in the spice trade. Spain and Portugal may have been knocked down a peg, but the big guy on campus was the Dutch East India Company. The irony is that this company was endorsed by the States General of Netherlands, which originated during the Dutch revolt against their Spanish rule, the very same uprising supported by Britain that ultimately led to tensions with Spain in the first place. It's like encouraging Batman to fight the Joker only for Robin to steal your wallet. Even though England was done fighting Spain, they started fighting the Dutch whilst continuing conflicts with Portugal, who were also at war with the Dutch. So that's like you teaming up with Robin to take on Harley Quinn whilst also teaming up with Harley Quinn to take on Robin. Things were getting complicated. All this naval warfare was getting nowhere fast. In order to get an advantage over their enemies, the East India Company needed to set up a foothold. All they had to do was strike a deal. The Mughal Empire reached the height of its power during the 17th century. In fact, they were one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires on the planet. Their influence spanned most of the Indian subcontinent, including present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even parts of Afghanistan. Their heritage was rich, their culture was revered, and their army was feared. But the EIC had a trick up their sleeve. They sent Captain William Hawkins in 1608 to woo the court, which he did by speaking Turkish, a language familiar to the Mughal court. By 1612, a trading post was erected in Surat. Though the initial trading post arrangement benefited the Mughal Empire, it angered the Portuguese and Dutch, whose own trading posts were being undermined. Another competitor on the scene was the Courtine Association of England. They had been given a license by Charles I, the king's dead father, to operate where the EIC had no presence. The East India Company were being squeezed on all sides, first by competitors and now by interlopers, but they didn't want to temper their ambitions. All the wealth made was necessary, in their eyes, for safeguarding their home country against antagonistic empires. I mean, what else are they supposed to do? Make peace? That's a terrible idea. The spice must flow. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize the next few decades of the story because the conflicts are dense, convoluted, and frankly, bizarre. Just know that the latter parts of the 1600s was a time when the East India Company fought the Dutch East India Trading Company, but teamed up with the Dutch to fight Portugal, who later gave England Bombay when King Charles II married Portugal's Catherine of Braganza. Despite this, the EIC still fought Portugal's merchants for their own political motives, meaning England and Portugal were kinda cool with each other now, but their merchants were not. Things only got more tense from here. Chapter 3. Best mates, stalemates, and checkmates. Things kicked up a notch around 1661, when Charles II gave the EIC rights to acquire territory, mint money, command fortresses, command troops, declare war, declare peace, and exercise civil and criminal jurisdiction. These powers effectively made the EIC a state power on the international stage. This was evil thing number 3. The laws don't apply. On paper, they were a mere private company setting up trading posts. In reality, they were their own militarized sovereignty, operating both in and outside of English jurisdiction. No longer did they need to get permission from back home. Now they had the money and means to call the shots. For example, forts and trading posts no longer had to be defended. Now they could go on the offense. They could hire locals to join the ranks, take prisoners, and elect their own diplomats. That'd be like today if McDonald's sent Ronald McDonald to set up embassies in foreign lands because Canada wrote them a permission slip. Soon their business rivals got their own set of powers, if they didn't have them already. The Dutch and English had a series of fights aptly named First Anglo-Dutch War, which started earlier in 1652, the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1665 after Charles II made the EIC go Super Saiyan, the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1672, and, you guessed it, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780. But they didn't just fight each other. Eventually, the likes of the East India Company went toe-to-toe with Indian states and provinces who stood in its way. Imagine if today McDonald's had shootouts with Burger King, Wendy's, and Hawaii. The EIC lost Bombay after Sidi Yaqub had sent a fleet to attack in 1689. But then the EIC apologized, so the emperor withdrew his troops. Once they were in the clear, the EIC just set up in Bombay, as well established a presence in Calcutta. All in all, the East India Company and its enemies were locked in a violent stalemate for roughly 150 years. That's a lot of fighting just so people back in London can drink tea. But as always in European history, things took a turn for the worse when France got involved. During the 7 Years' War in Europe, France and Britain used the East Indies as a proxy war as part of their campaign for global dominance. Both had been making sizable gains in the area, but the rise and fall of competing Indian empires was creating political turbulence. Everything came ahead in 1756, when Siraj-ud-Daulah became Nawab of Bengal. Though Bengal was under the Mughal Empire structure, it was composed of different regions, entities, and self-governing groups, like the Galactic Senate in the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Siraj-ud-Daulah was growing concerned with the EIC's increasing military capabilities, so he demanded the British to seize their unauthorized fortifying of Fort William trading post in Calcutta. The Trade Federation, the East India Company, only partially complied with the demand because they said they needed to defend themselves against the French. Turns out they should have been more concerned about Siraj-ud-Daulah, because he captured the fort with his army in June of 1756. I suppose in the eyes of the EIC, he had just proven their point. In response, Robert Clive was dispatched to reclaim Calcutta by force. He succeeded and signed a treaty with Siraj-ud-Daulah. However, Clive was conspiring with Siraj's own disaffected commander, Mir Jafar, to overthrow him. In British colonial history, this was Order 66, or as we like to call it, Evil Thing Number 4, Betray Your Allies. The surprise attack became known as the Battle of Plassey, and resulted in Clive's decisive victory, Siraj's execution, Jafar's puppet rule, and the official start of British colonialization. Chapter 4: Hostile Takeover. By this time in the 18th century, the EIC was bigger than the British government. Back home, the government was taking in about £8 million a year, but the EIC was earning a quarter of that just from their Bengal revenue. When the 19th century started, the EIC's private army was about 260,000 in total. Britain was smaller at 200,000, because they didn't have European officers or Indian soldiers in their ranks. All this, plus a formidable navy, helped the EIC spread throughout India in no time, not just in geographical terms, but also political and cultural. No colonialist worth their salt is going to allow conquered people to carry on as usual. They forced their Indian subjects to get with the program. The EIC imported British values, laws, and principles. Though you could argue this introduced some good ideas, like universities, railways, telegraphs, and cartography. It came at a tremendous cost. Let's call this Evil Thing Number 5, Good Old-Fashioned Subjugation. Local and indigenous ways of life were erased. Languages were lost. Traditional cultures and traditions were upended. Religious and social tensions were exacerbated, especially when Christian missionaries rocked up. No one likes a Christian missionary. One of the most devastating consequences has to be how EIC controlled trade. To modernize India, they imported British goods. However, the influx undermined the work of weavers, artisans, and farmers. Poverty started to spread. But the EIC wasn't too concerned with how the economy was affecting others, because they found a neat little side hustle, aka Evil Thing Number 6, literal slaves. Though their buying and selling of human beings was limited compared to the transatlantic slave trade, that was mainly because they didn't want to directly compete. They also used slaves in their own trading posts, particularly as the EIC spread its influence across Asia and African lands, like Madagascar. Servitude went wherever the EIC went, either by force or through heavy taxation and exploitative working conditions. The most catastrophic fallout from this was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where an entire third of the Bengal population perished. Though weather conditions had contributed, like a fierce drought, the conditions were worsened by the company's policies and practices. Revenue extraction did not let up in the face of crop failure, leaving very little for the starving population to live on. Land for crops was even reduced because the EIC stepped up its production of opium and indigo exports. As you can imagine, their relief aid was inadequate. They were undoubtedly more focused on the bottom line than figuring out a way to control the soaring cost of basic food supplies. Their indifference continued through subsequent famines too. Though other contributing factors means we can't outright call it genocide, we can call it Evil Thing Number 7, causing widespread pain and misery. Unfortunately, the East India Company still had 100 years to go until it closed shop. Chapter 5: Endgame. After the famine, criticism of the EIC was widespread. In response, Britain passed the Regulating Act of 1773. The design was for the British government to reclaim greater control over the EIC by having a say in their activities. Yet the EIC continued its expansion. Another step was needed. By 1784, there was the Pitt's India Act, which created a board of control to oversee the company's civil, military, and revenue affairs. In effect, the EIC was reduced to a managing agent of the British government. The increase of executives, middle managers, and other proto-corporate tropes had slowed the central decision-making, effectively cutting the company from the inside out. Wait, a company becomes more inefficient the more executives and managers there are? Who would have thought? Don't gloat too soon. Even with this added weight, the EIC continued to expand through war and even annexed whole states. It was too big to fail. The monster was out of control. But not for long. By the start of the 19th century, abolitionist movements were gaining momentum. Though it would still be many decades until Britain passed Emancipation Acts, it was enough for the EIC to start exiting the slave trade. Now, they were weighed down by suits, spread thin, and losing revenue. They were dying from the inside out like a Silicon Valley startup. Then, in 1857, almost 70 years since the British government decided to slow the EIC, there was an uprising. The Indian Rebellion was a major pushback against the company. The sepoys had had enough of economic exploitation and cultural insensitivity. Alas, their resistance was short-lived, but not in vain. The British government saw that the failed rebellion would lead to more revolts. The longer they stayed in the game, the higher the chance of a successful overthrow. It was time to cut their losses. 1 year after the uprising, the Government of India Act was passed, spelling out the end of company rule. In its place, the Brits erected the British Raj as the formal, official, and direct rule by the government. So, the Galactic Empire had been defeated, but the First Order had been created. Cool. Still, it's kind of ironic that after over 200 years of colonialism, the company was taken over. It was dragged back to Britain and stripped of all of its administrative powers. Now it existed in a strictly legal sense. It was nothing more than its name on a piece of paper. When 1873 rolled around, it was time to end the EIC once and for all. The British Parliament passed the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act to dissolve the company. They sat down with the accounting books and shareholders, crunched the numbers, tallied the assets, and wrote some checks. Once it was all done and dusted, the doors were closed on the East India Company for good. Their influence and dominance on international trade finally ended after a quarter of a millennium. To think it wouldn't have happened if Francis Drake hadn't been such a good door-to-door salesman. But was their influence worse than we described, or are other countries being let off the hook? Let us know in the comments below. Now, you're probably thinking that all big companies must come to an end. But that's not the case. Go and watch our video on the company that has survived for over 1,000 years and is still around today. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.